too. So you should be looking at the README right now. And I'll just go over briefly the tech stack that we're working with. So obviously React. We're using TypeScript. We're using Create React App to easily scaffold together all of the Webpack and testing dependencies and all those kinds of things. We're using Jest for our test runner and our assertions. We're using React Testing Library, which is now kind of bundled together in Create React App. And I've got limited experience with Enzyme. If you've used that one before, I feel React Testing Library is a little easier to get going and has some fundamentals that we both liked that we'll get into in just a minute. We're using data randomization through a library called Faker. And this is kind of a new one for me anyway, React Hooks Testing Library to test some custom hook, the custom hook that we wrote as part of this. So we've got some instructions for how to run it, pretty straightforward. And testing philosophies. So, I realize that, the tech stack in itself is enough to spark some disagreements and conversations, so that's fun, and I'm sure these testing philosophies will be the same way. So we do not write snapshot tests. They detect changes and not bugs. So, just because something changes doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bug. And so we don't see that provides a lot of value. They're easily broken. They're hard to review and they need to be updated. And a lot of the times if you've got a large snapshot that needs to be updated, the easiest thing to do is just run the update command and you don't even look to see what changed. And so, at that point, the test is not providing much value. They don't really test application logic either. So that's not something we're going to cover in this particular example. And there's this interesting idea. We reference Kent C. Dodds a lot. He's got a lot of good insight, and I believe he's actually the author of the React Testing Library. So he's a very good resource for all of this. So his preference is to basically do integration tests in the sense that, it's preferable to render a component and all of its child components together so that you're really testing all of that. As opposed to shallow rendering, which was a common concept in the Enzyme ecosystem. And so, we can also debate the definition of unit versus integration testing, but in this application, integration just simply means the two React components together, still within the same UI application. And then there's data randomization that I mentioned before, kind of encapsulated into a group of functions called the any functions. And Jason will cover that a little bit later. Just the basic idea is that if you send in random data to your test, you're more likely to find hidden bugs than if you just had static data that you're passing in your unit test. And then here, this is kind of a core concept that Kent Dodds had put forth as part of React Testing Library, and that's when you render a component and you want to select an element on it, it's better to select that element by a text or placeholder or some other visual characteristic so that you're thinking like your users. You can also use role selection, which has a tie-in with accessibility, which, if you're keeping that in mind as you're writing test and test-driven development, you're going to be writing a more accessible app. If you're using IDs or class selectors, then you're thinking more about implementation than your user. So yeah, those are just some core kind of philosophies that we've had when we were writing these tests. And then here in the README, there's some resources kind of that go over in more detail some of these things I just mentioned. So and with that, this is the amazing, beautiful People app. It is a list of people or persons. I actually thought way too hard about whether it should be people or persons the entire time and got distracted with that. But for now, it's the People app. And you can look at people and you can also delete them. And we get random data each time, and it's very entertaining to look at the combinations of names and email addresses and things like that too. So if you're looking for some entertainment, you could just refresh the app a bunch of times. And so with that, I will jump in here to the components. So we have the table, and again, some of this is contrived. It's, but it is what it is, just to illustrate some points. So this is the table, and it's a very simple HTML table, and then we are mapping over the people data here with another and rendering a new person row component for each one, and that's a custom component we wrote. We've got some state where we're setting the people. We've got a use effect here at the top that makes a call to a service. So we have a service over here, and basically the service is just, you know, rendering random data. But it does illustrate kind of a, you know, segmenting out your application and encapsulating your service calls so that they can easily be switched out or mocked or any of the things that you need to do, just as an architecture concern. And so we have people, person row, and so here's the person row. It's very straightforward, and it has, you know, a cell that has an on-click and a callback to delete the person from the state right here. And again, you know, that's not necessarily the best pattern, but it is a way that we can illustrate some things here. So, so I'll jump into the first test. This is the person row test. And so the first thing you'll notice here is we've got a Jest function. So this is basically just a way to create a dummy function that you can spy on. And so when we pass it in for the on-delete callback, you know, this function is not actually doing anything, but it does allow us to ensure that the function is called, right? So, you know, Jest has a very robust set of mocking functions that we'll get into a little bit later. And this is a good illustration of one here. You'll notice here for the person that we're passing in for the person row, this is any.person. That's basically just the data randomization that I mentioned before, and Jason will get into a little more. So basically just rendering a person row, and I've wrapped it in the table simply because React gives a warning if you try to render a TR, you know, without any sort of outer wrapper. And, you know, what that really indicates is this is not how you would do it in real life, but that's the reason that it's wrapped in a table there. All right, so we've rendered it here, and then we're using this fire event.click. And so basically this is, you know, React testing library has kind of wrapped the JavaScript fire event function here where we can just, you know, execute a click event. And then we pass in the selector. And so that's what the screen get by text is. So this render method right here is from React testing library, and it actually returns a bunch of functions and, you know, the raw HTML. And the functions that it returns are things like query by text, find by text, query by placeholder, just selectors that you can use to get elements from the HTML that you've rendered here. So if you wanted to, you know, you could destructure get by text that way and then call that directly. But more recent versions of React testing library have supplied this screen object that we can just import right here. And it's more succinct than having to manage the variables in your test. And so that's what we're doing here, screen get by text. And I'm calling X because that is, whoops, that's just the text right here on the button itself. So again, we're thinking like the user here. Couple of things to note about get by text. There are various, so there's a query by, there's a get by, there are different types of things. So the thing that get by text does is if it doesn't find the element that you've asked it to find, it's going to throw an exception. So if in that case, you know, if the X was not there, it would blow up our test right here. The query by will actually return a null. And so if you're trying to assert that something is not present in the DOM, you would want to use query by, and then your assertion after the fact would be, you know, I'm expecting this to be null, or I'm expecting it not to be in the document. But you can notice if we did query by text here, I'm going to get an error. It's a TypeScript error that's basically saying, hey, this can be null, and you might be trying to perform an operation on a null object here. And so that's why get by text is the best selector to use in this case. And there's a bunch of really good documentation. React testing library is very well documented. So there, you know, there's a great kind of comparison of all the different things you can do. So, you know, display value, label text, role, test ID, and test ID is kind of like a last resort. So if you don't have a good way to select by something visual, you can just put a custom data.testID or data-testID attribute and use that. So check that out. That's really good. And there's actually, I think that I linked to it in the README. There's a really good article, yeah, Common Mistakes with React Testing Library. And that that is a very comprehensive things that I'm sure we did on the way on this project. So it's really helpful. All right, so the assertion for this one is pretty straightforward. After we click the X button here, we're making sure that the handle delete has been called. And so if you're using one of these Jest functions here, there's a pretty robust set of functions. So you can expect that it's been called a number of times. You can expect that it's been called with certain properties. And within that, you can say, you don't have to list out all the properties. You can say, you know, has been called with, you know, 4 properties, and one of them was, you know, some value that you expect. So a lot of good functionality there. And that's just a really simple version of, you know, rendering and then interacting and then making sure that you've called a function and how to use, you know, the spy. Just some good basics there. Let's see, it looks like I've got one more here. So I'll switch over here to the table right here. And in a minute, Jason's going to kind of go through this a little bit more. But I will mention one thing here. Each library comes built in with Jest. So if you come from a C# background like I do, you've probably used XUnit, the inline data attribute, or InUnit, I think it's row, that allow you to execute the same test with different data. And that's basically what this is doing here. So you can see we've got, you know, for our headers, first name, last name, email address, and actions, we're basically running the same block of code with different inputs. And so we're making sure that, you know, each one of these is present in the document. And you can, I think this is how you do it here. You can, so if you had different parameters that you wanted to pass in here, you can actually do an array for each one, and so you can access multiple parameters there. So great, I broke it, of course. Here, let's get back to where it was. There we go. But yeah, that's let's open up here and we'll run the test real quick just so we can see them. Nothing too much to see there, but this is a cool feature too, where you can actually, this %s right here is actually going to get the name of the value that you passed in. So if the test fails, it would say, you know, should display the header first name has failed. So it's a good way to kind of distinguish between the inputs that you're doing there and the test that you're in. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm going to stop and hand it off to Jason here. And Jason, I can, if you just tell me where you want to go, I can drive for you here visually. Is there, are there any questions or comments before Jason takes over?
Got a few in the chat. Do all these testing libraries have TypeScript implementations? Is the IntelliSense because of TypeScript? Oh, I guess that was answered. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so the group can hear, there are type definitions for all of the libraries that we're using. So we find it very helpful.
Yeah.
And then another thing is, Aaron, let's go ahead and just demo so change first name to first name 1 or something like that, and just kind of show how that displays. I think that's worth demonstrating some of this stuff. And I see this other question. So how are these tests integrated into CI/CD pipelines? Yes, so absolutely, you can run these as part of your pipelines, and highly suggest that you do. there's a number of ways you can do it to have it as kind of a pre-merge build step. So if tests don't pass, you can't merge into master. Does that kind of answer the question there?
And of course, in the package JSON, you can define the scripts that you use to run the test. And so basically in the CI, in your pipeline definition, you'd basically just be running, yarn test or npm test. And Jest has a bunch of built-in capabilities for code coverage and things like that. So in your config, and I think you either do it in the package JSON definition or maybe in your Jest config. You can set up a separate config for Jest where you basically say, yes, I want to capture code coverage and I want to output it in Cobertura format or whatever. And then you can copy that Cobertura output and say, for example, Jenkins has a really good plugin for analyzing code coverage, and then you can just put it right there on the front page of your pipeline.
And as far as giving customers visibility to the test, I mean, you can generate reports and things like that. And so if you've taken care and time to name your test well, then you can have a printout of the requirements that you are satisfying and verifying that they're satisfied in your test, and they may find that useful. I can't say I've seen a lot of demand for that, but it's seems like a good way to give your clients confidence that you're doing a good job with the testing. So there's that. Any other questions or follow-ups to that? Okay, keep moving for now. All right, yeah, so we'll start back here. Let me get my notes pulled up here. Okay, so we've already seen a little bit of the mocking, so maybe we'll just go ahead and start there. We're using Jest mock, and so you'll see on line 14 there, where we use this Jest mock statement and provide the path, the same path, by the way, that is used in the component you're testing. So one little gotcha that I've run into would be if you import something in a different way in your component than you do when you try to mock here, it may not work out exactly like you planned. So make sure you get those lined up. But what happens is when you use this mock statement, it's going to look for a file in a mocks folder. And so, Aaron, if you can show that. So there's a mocks folder, and we have something that's called the same thing. And it essentially just replaces the file that you're going to use, that the original component is using.
It's important too in your mock version to wrap the function in the jest.fn there, which just allows you to do kind of what we were looking at before. You can actually watch the number of times it was called and the parameters it was called with and all those kinds of things. If you don't wrap it in Jest function, you won't be able to do that.
Right, right. Something else to note about this is, in order to illustrate some of the timer mocking, we're using set timeout in our mock here. That's not something you'd typically do in your mock, but again, just to kind of demonstrate some of that.
And also, that's useful too if you're using a component to, if you're doing a skeleton loader, or if you're doing a spinner or something like that while something's loading, you can actually do something like this and increase the timeout to 3,000 here, just so that you can take a look at your loader component and make sure that it does what you want it to do. So it's useful for that reason too.
All right, so let's go back to our test. And so yeah, that explains that line. Now the next line, line 18. So we've mocked this get people function, but in order for us to use some of the mock capabilities, we need to be able to cast it into something that TypeScript recognizes. And so that's all that line is doing. And so throughout the test, we'll be using that. An example would be on line 33. So we just want to tell, for this test, we want to return a particular set of data. It's empty set of data. because it doesn't matter if we have data or not for our table when we're just testing the headers. Another thing of note is that after each. So, and can we keep the test running throughout this? So we'll comment out lines and kind of see what happens when we move things. So we should be back to passing at this point. Yes. Okay. So the mock is shared across all of these tests, which means if you make a call to it, it's tracking that. So for every time that we've rendered the people table, that function gets called, and our mocking framework is tracking how many times it was called. And so this after each is just going back and resetting those counts. So go ahead and comment that out and run it. I'll kind of explain what was described in the comment there. So one, I don't know how many people are familiar with the acronym FIRST. It's just advice on good tests, I guess. So F being fast, I being isolated, R being repeatable, S being self-validating, and T being timely. If we don't restart that mock, we have a problem where one test can affect tests that run later, which means it's not isolated or independent. And so you can kind of see that right here where we were expecting to see 1 calls, but we received 6. And that's just because we hadn't reset the mock. So any questions about that? Okay.
Jason, that's just the only way to set up the mocks? It's not a decision you've made to scope it out there, right? It's the way it has to be.
It's a little bit different than some of the stuff that I've done in C# where it's a little bit easier to scope it. I'm not prepared to talk about all the nuances of that, but
I mean, it's
say
pretty,
that inside of your it, you can create the mock there, and then it's scoped to just within inside your it. So so the Jest.mock at the top is going to hoist that to the very top, and it'll have global scope. But if you declare the mock inside of your it, then I guess if you reassign the mock inside of your it will be scoped locally inside of the it. Because every time you say Jest.mock, it gets hoisted all the way to the top, no matter where you declare that. But you can redeclare it inside of your test, reassign the value of it every time, and that will also reset it.
and you can also define the body of your mock in the same file here instead of using that whole __ mocks convention. But if you do that, like Hunter was saying, since it hoists it to the top, it runs before the imports, and you can't actually, use imported modules inside of it. You can't declare variables inside of it. You have no control over it. So, if you absolutely just wanted a static mock, you could do something like that, and mock specific functions inside of it, but you have no control.
so fortunately, Aaron and Hunter were ready to provide those nuances. I was not. So, yep, cool. All right, what else? So yeah, the any class. Some of you, I know some of you have seen it before, but for those of you that have not, this is something we do to limit invariance. And so what I mean by that is we want to isolate the things that matter and keep those consistent in our test, but the things that we don't think will affect the outcome of the test, we want to randomize that. And that has a lot of different benefits, but the main one is if you've made an assumption that this particular variable or this particular state doesn't affect the outcome of the test, and it does, that's something that you probably want to know, because it's an indication that your test may not be valid. And so, yeah, if you randomize the thing that shouldn't impact the result of the test and it causes the test to fail, you need to go look at that. Let's see. Any questions about that in particular? That's Okay. So we're doing that. Did you show the any file? Right. So yeah, you can see here we're using Faker to generate that. We've also got some little convenience methods. So we could, on line 4, we could be typing faker.random.number all over the place, but this just, I don't know, it looks a little cleaner in the code. Same with collection of, this is just a quick way to generate a collection of some of the other things that you're generating. So we can go back to the test now. Okay. I mentioned the timers earlier. Well, sorry, before that, you'll notice on 57, expected people, we're generating a collection, a random number of people. And then we're telling our service that we want to return some number of people, 1 or more in this case. And then really the point of this first test is just to say that we've only fetched the data once. If you look back at your component and the use effect, you'll notice that our second parameter is an empty array, which means this use effect only fires the one time on load. So I'm sure it's not hard to imagine why you might want to do something like that, but sometimes it's expensive to fetch data. This is one way to ensure that we're not going and pulling data unnecessarily. All right, we'll go back to the test. The timers. All right, so I'm gonna get control of timers. Sorry, scroll to the top of, yeah. And so we have to declare that we're using fake timers. So this allows Jest to kind of hook into that and allow us to control, so we can advance through time instantly rather than having to wait for a full timeout or something like that. So we declare it there, which allows us then in our test to make that call to run all timers, which just says advance the timers, so that we can get to where we're going immediately. Are there any questions about that? All right, all good. Let's see, keep scrolling. Get down some of these other tests. All right, so here we've got some more examples of the limiting invariance using our any class. And what we're doing here is we're putting a random number of things in our grid and then randomly selecting one to delete, and then verifying that we did indeed delete something. So this is a behavior that the user would expect, right? I hit the X button, the row goes away. And the other thing to note here is that we're fetching something by role. So accessibility, or using the accessibility roles to select things was kind of new to me, but it's a great little tool because not only is it something that's very consistently supported by browsers, it also allows you to have some confidence that users that are using like screen readers and things like that will be able to use your app. So that should be your first go-to for any of your selectors, is to try to grab it by some role. Let's see here. And still no questions. I think we're getting kind of to the end of that. There may have been one other thing that we wanted to look at in the component, and that use effect. If you haven't seen it before, we're returning something here. So a common error that you might see in React is that you basically tried to render something after it was unloaded, and which may indicate a memory leak. And so what we're doing here is we make our call, but if the component happens to unload, it's going to execute this, what the anonymous method that's executed at the end of the use effect, which essentially just sets a variable that says, hey, we've been unsubscribed, so we don't want to set our state variable, because setting state variables will trigger a re-render of the component. Yeah, and so, you know, that's something that will show up if you don't, if you aren't mindful of it. And
It usually gives React has a warning about, you know, it's a memory leak, no op sort of thing. It didn't show up that time, but yeah.
Yeah.
All right, do you want me to?
Yeah,
Go
did
ahead.
you want to switch over to the hooks example that you had?
Yeah, did somebody have a question or comment there? Okay, I thought I heard somebody. All right, so, you know, before, in the previous examples, we had a use effect and we were directly making a service call in that. One thing that's really great about using pure functional components in React is that you can kind of hook into what's the term I'm looking for? You can basically create your own custom hooks to do this work for you. And so this is a custom hook that we created that actually goes and gets the data. And so you can see this is exactly the same thing that we had in the table component itself previously, but now it's encapsulated inside of here, inside the you know, inside the component itself. It's just a single line right here, and that actually makes the test look a lot nicer too. You know, so we've got just 1 or 2 lines of things here. You can mock the hook just like you would the service call. Yeah, and you can still do the, you know, the use people was called one time, all the same tricks there. It's just a little bit cleaner. Separation of concerns is nice there. So yeah, that's about it. Just another way to do it. But yeah, I think that's it as far as you know, what we had set up in this example app. So you guys want to talk about any of this, or, you know, have philosophical debates about the various ways to perform any of these things, that's great too.
Or share experiences of how you're
Yeah.
doing it. I'd love to hear how other companies are tackling these issues.
One question is the subscribed thing, that's a concept I'm not as familiar with since I haven't used React much, but is that something you're covering by tests, or is that, yeah, I guess that's the question. Is that something you would cover effectively?
It's kind of implicitly covered in this test that it should fetch people data once. Because if we didn't have this here, let's see, do I still have the test running?
Well, the other thing, I think, to be able to test this, you would have to find some way to stop loading the component after you started fetching the data, but before you set the state. I'm not sure how to do that. Now, you said you weren't as familiar with React, so I can probably add a little bit more context to what's going on with the use effect. Use effect's going to happen when the component loads, and then potentially every time it re-renders. The thing, it allows you to return a method that's called when it unloads, and that's kind of the syntax there. the array at the bottom would allow you to watch variables or things like that that might make you want to re-render. And so you could put watch variables in there that say this use effect runs the first time it's rendered and when X variable changes.
And if you've seen in previous versions of React, components were class-based, and there were, you know, half a dozen lifecycle methods that were used instead of use effects. So you had like component did mount, component did update, you know, component did unmount, and all those kinds of things. And you had to handle all those separately. Use effect allows you to basically manage all of that in a single function. You know, it's going to run one time at the beginning if you have no dependencies, and then it can run, you know, based on what you send it in as the dependencies, and then the return function is just basically when the component unmounts. So it puts it all together in one nice function there.
Yeah, thanks. I know those kinds of life cycle things are one thing we struggle with testing, or we go out of our way sometimes trying to manage the stage of the component's life cycle and check for those things happening. So I was just wondering how explicitly you were testing things like that.
I think this way of testing though is more about like user interaction, right? Rather than really getting into it. It's all about what the user's seeing.
Yeah, but a memory leak is always going to be hard to test for, I guess. So
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, the good news there is that React will start warning you in the console if you have leaks like that. So it's nice in that way. But yeah, it would be nice to find a good way to test that more explicitly. That's definitely something we can look into and report back if and when we figure it out.
or maybe not, like Robert's saying. I mean, some of these things we can easily go overboard on. If there's another way to catch it, you know, it depends how many tests or how many hoops you have to jump through to get it covered. But it could become just another change detector test, depending on what's available. You know.
I have a general React question that may have probably a little bit, but with the use effect in particular, that return function. First of all, so this, as y'all mentioned, is going to run once when the component mounts, and then we'll run again when it unmounts. Y'all do components that have multiple use effects. If you want to watch like specific dependencies, or is that bad? And then second of all, if we do a return function there, if we have those dependencies, is that going to run when it unmounts or when those dependencies?
So I have done, yes, multiple use effects. If the things that you're trying to accomplish are completely unrelated, I think it makes sense to have multiple use effects. So yes, that's the answer to that question. And the second question was the return function. Does that run? Well, I'm sorry, can you repeat that part?
Yeah, sorry. So if you have dependencies in that array, does it still run when it's unmounted, or when? And I mainly don't remember what y'all said, but does it run when the component is unmounted, or does it run every time basically that those dependencies update? That makes sense.
I think it runs when it's unmounted. Hunter, I'm gonna call you out, put you on the spot, see if you know the answer to that.
Woo! Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's when it gets unmounted.
I agree. Yeah.
So yeah, so if you had multiple use effects, each of which had their own return function, that could potentially be. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, anything else?
Can you go back to the test where you're deleting a person? So in this test, pretty much the expectation is that your number of people is just decremented by 1, but you're not really testing that the correct person was deleted. Where would you do that? And
Yeah,
would
sure.
that just be an enhancement in this test?
Yeah, you could definitely change this test to be more specific. One way you might do that would be to insert something into the people collection at the top where you knew the values. So you have randomized data, and then you have one where you know what it is, and then you could verify that that it shows up. Delete that particular one. So when you're searching, you could give it the name of the thing that you've seeded. So if I added Jason as my thing, I would search for Jason and click its delete button, and then I could verify after that it was removed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that I agree, that would be a better test, by the way.
All right, thanks.
Well,
All right.
that's it. Jennifer, any closing thoughts?
Sure. Guys, that was great. Thank you so much. I learned a ton, took a lot of notes. Something I've been doing a lot personally too. It's really helpful. Thank you for sharing what you know. I'll post this recording on Slack and then send it out through the Meetup email as well. I need to set up like a YouTube channel to post all of our recordings, which I'll figure that out soon. But and then guys, if you can send me the GitHub link or however you want to do that, and I'll disperse it out so you can post it in Slack and I'll get it from there. That'd be great. Just kind of closing thoughts. Please do reach out if you've got something you want to share. We all have knowledge that would help others, or if you want to host just kind of a discussion or a workshop where you want to build stuff together, let me know what you want to do. And Turn Micro gives 4 Uber Eats gift cards away each time we do one of these, and so Justin just randomly selected 4 people, and so congrats to Miyuki and Aubrey and Stan and Ila, I think is how you pronounce that. So Ila. So if you'll just send Justin your email addresses and he will send you your Uber Eats gift cards. So congrats. And
on Monday today.
On Monday? So she said. Yeah, great. So big shout out to Turn Micro for providing the Zoom environment and for those Uber Eats gift cards. They do awesome security stuff, have a great culture, and I may give Justin a few minutes to tell us about their company in just a second. But guys, thanks so much for joining us, and keep a lookout. We may be moving this to Thursdays in coming months, so I'll let you know. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Jason. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, just shoot me your email addresses in the chat or chat it to me privately, and I'll buy you $25 worth of Uber Eats and send it to you on Monday. And if you want to build anything in AWS, Azure, or Google, if you do so, please use some of the Trend Micro solutions. We shift all the way to the left to the developer and then help you all the way to runtime with your applications. So we're here to help make the DevOps and CI/CD pipeline as seamless and as secure and frictionless as possible, so you can be secure as well as get all your code commits and updates and everything done. So that's what we're here for.
Justin and Turn Micro also partner up with AWS in Birmingham and host some really awesome events. So if you use AWS at your organization, check those out on Meetup. There's lots of great meetups to get involved in the tech community. There's a .NET, Agile, SQL Server, UX meetup that's fantastic. So lots of places to plug in and learn.
And Jennifer just reminded me, we are having AWS. They're going to